Alrighty, can everyone hear me all right? I'm going to assume that's a yes. The chats are on for those who want to. Just wait for a couple more people to jump in and then we'll get started. Oh yeah, awesome. It seems that everyone can hear me all right. As you can see, I'm wearing a nice manly pink shirt today. My wife suggested that all I was missing was a medallion to hang around my chest. Alrighty. Okay, so let's get started and we'll see how things... thanks, Josie. Okay, so let's just start at the very beginning. And I thought this is the very first episode of Forge, this new live stream that I want to do on a regular basis, specifically about masculinity and men's issues and things like that. And so I thought I'd start at the very beginning and explain why the name Forge, what each episode is going to be all about, and then we'd sort of jump in from there. So, sorry, just, there we go, done. Alrighty. Sorry, dealing with a technical issue there. Okay, so why call it Forge? Well, obviously for those who know anything about blacksmithing and metalwork, you'll know that a forge is a device that is used by the blacksmith. It's a type of hearth that's used, or a hearth, depending on which. You're welcome, Child Harold. Females most welcome. It's a hearth or a hearth, depending on which side of the railroad tracks you come from, that is used by a blacksmith to heat metal for the process of moulding and shaping that metal. And so a forge, obviously, it appealed to me as a really ideal name for this live stream, because what a forge does is it's about a fine tuning of the fire, the air around it, and everything else to actually be able to produce something, that's going to last and something that's going to be beneficial. And then there's also the fact there's an intensity involved in a forge. It's not something that happens lightly. It's not something that just happens by chance. That there's a real commitment involved in that aspect of the blacksmith's workshop. And then, of course, on top of all of that, there's the fact that when you forge something, there's effort involved. It takes effort. It takes work to actually forge a thing. Like, we all understand that forging something involves a process. Like for a blacksmith, there's a beating of a hammer involved. It's metal on metal. There's heat. There's intensity. And so there's something I think important and as a metaphor for us as men in the whole concept of a forge and what it is to actually forge masculinity in a way that's authentic and good in the world. So that's why I went with that name. What will the actual live streams be like? Well, I'm glad you asked. Each live stream will start with a bit of a few thoughts from me, sharing my thoughts on a particular or specific topic related to masculinity. And then after that, we'll open the floor for live stream questions and comments. You can say what you want. I'll respond to stuff as we go. And I want to finish each episode by leaving you with a bit of a challenge. Something, maybe something reflective, a piece of poetry, a movie, a song, something that's been in the news, whatever, that might also present an opportunity for us to reflect on our own masculinity and to think about our place in the world as men and how we can live that out well. One of the things that I thought I wanted to do, it's really important about these Forge live streams, is I want them to be places where, you can actually bring your questions to the table. So if there's particular issues that you want me to talk about, particular questions that you have, then please send them to me and we'll make them actual centerpieces. If you're okay with it, we'll read out your correspondence, or like I've done in the past with other things, I can leave out your details. I can just read the correspondence you send without naming you. If you want to do it that way, that's fine. And we can actually talk about stuff that, and I can respond to and engage with issues that are important to you. It's no good just me talking into the wind, and it's not really hitting the mark. So how do you send me correspondence like that? Well, probably the best way to do it is email. And the details for how you can email me are found in the video description below. So please do that, and I'll address that kind of correspondence as you, hi there, Golden Wings, good to have you back. Please, send that correspondence to me, and we'll make it the focus of future episodes. Because as I said, I really want to respond, and I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. Like I said last time, be very wary of anyone who claims to be an expert and has got it all figured out. But I've made enough mistakes, I think, to have learned a few things along the way that might be valuable. And if not, this is the beauty of a live stream. If I can't give an answer to something, then there's probably a pretty good chance that there's someone else in the room here, so to speak, quote unquote, the room, who actually might have a little bit of wisdom to offer. And so there's a sort of a sense of community and doing this together. And interestingly, I read an article last year about this issue in relation to men working together who had, men with quite serious issues like addiction and things like that. And they responded best when they were put together in groups. So men who were struggling with particular addiction, for example, who were together in support groups, what would happen is one of the guys in the group would have figured out a really good way to solve a particular problem. And the therapist hadn't really thought about it in that light. And they would share something that had been successful or fruitful for them. And other men in the group had said, hey, that's a really good idea. I can do that too. So, that's sort of the sort of dynamic that I'm hoping will start to form out of this little community as well. But yeah, please send me those questions and issues, and we can make sure that we talk about them. How often will Forge live streams? Sorry, they'll happen at this stage to start with on a monthly basis, and we'll just see how we go from there. As I said, the chat is open, and Super Chat is on as well. If you want to show your support that way for the work that I'm doing. So today's topic, why should every man keep a vegetable garden? Now this kind of seems like a bit of a strange topic to start with, but it's been something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And the humble vegetable garden is actually, I think, something quite good for us as men. And it grows some really important aspects of human flourishing in us, no pun intended. And so I thought today I would talk about this idea of why I think every man should keep a vegetable garden of some sort, and what it actually does for us as men that's so important. So before I get into the why I think it's important and what the benefits are, how do you go about actually growing a vegetable garden if you've never done that before? Well, this video is not going to be a how-to tutorial on how to grow veggies. For those who came here looking for practical tips for growing the best tomatoes, or how do I get my pumpkins to the, so that they're the sort of the prize-winning pumpkins in the town. That's not what this live stream is going to be about. So if you've come here looking for gardening advice, apologies. This is not what this live stream is about. This is about, authentic masculinity, and I guess the sort of the philosophy, if you like, of gardening, and what gardening in a sense. And it might not be just gardening. There are other things as well that do the same thing for us as men. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's not going to be a practical how-to guide. So if you want really in-depth practical advice about gardening, that's not this episode. But you can find that on YouTube. That's the great thing about YouTube. Second biggest search engine in the world, YouTube. And so there's plenty of advice and plenty of practical advice. You can Google it, you can YouTube it, you can find out all the practical tips you need about how to do that if you've never ever gardened before. But in a nutshell, it is as simple as finding a patch of ground that is available to you and then using it for that purpose. If it's got grass growing on it currently, you simply mark out your little patch of earth that you want to turn into a veggie garden, and you turn that grass over and you expose the dirt side of it. You'd add a bit of veggie mulch and stuff like that, and then hey presto, you're ready to start planting veggies. But as I said, for the more practical, in-depth stuff and the real expertise of gardening, check out YouTube. If you haven't got a patch of earth to call your own, so let's say you're renting, or you live somewhere small, or you're an inner city dweller, or for whatever reasons, lots of people maybe don't have a patch of earth. Maybe buy yourself a raised garden bed, or make a small raised garden bed somewhere. You can even tend gardens in a plastic bin. So get yourself one of those big commercial plastic bins, chop it in half lengthways or even widthways if you want, and you put a bit of veggie mix in there and you're ready to go. Don't forget to drill drainage holes. That's kind of important. Otherwise you'll drown everything. And don't forget that wherever you sit it, it's going to drain water. So just, don't forget to compensate for that. But that's how simple it is to actually to have a garden, just like a patch of earth that you garden. Now, why would this be something that's so important for us as men? What is it about gardening that matters? Well, first of all, there's a connection to the natural world. And I think that's really, really important for us as men. Once upon a time, we were very connected as human beings to the natural world around us. We lived and breathed the cycles of the natural world, and it was just sort of part of who we were. But now we're very disconnected from that, and our modern way of living tends to disconnect us from that. Now, there's lots of good things about our modern way of living, advances in medicine and lots of creature comforts that are great we wouldn't be without. But at the same time, we've also lost an important connection, I think, to the natural world. And so gardening is sort of just a simple way to get us back into something of the sort of cyclical nature of the natural world. And there's a sort of an irony to the current state of things as well, in the sense that we are now more knowledgeable about nature, about the mechanics of nature, how plants grow, why they grow, what it takes, the science behind it all. We're more knowledgeable than we've ever been, and that knowledge is more widespread and more available to us. And we're also now more obsessed with saving nature and protecting nature than we've ever been before, to the point for some people where it's just like almost like an obsessive ideological commitment. But the funny thing is, the irony in all of that is that we're also at the same time, a large percentage of those of us who would have a greater level of knowledge about these things and more of a commitment to protecting nature are also probably less connected to it than we've ever been before as well. And I think there's something good about getting reconnected with nature and the natural world for us as men. Secondly, and this is I think an important one, gardening is something that actually gives you important practical skills. And I can't understate how important this is for men. Men need practical skills. A lot of men are missing out on this. A lot of men are missing out on practical skills that actually are meaningful skills that actually do something good in the world. So gardening is one of those things that having the skill to actually grow vegetables and plants is something that can actually come in really handy, is an important thing. It might be a skill that could literally be the sort of the make or break thing financially for you. If you've got a family or you're in a situation in future where you need to grow your own vegetables, you don't have the finances available to you in future to be going down to the supermarket and purchasing all your vegetables that way. It's actually an important skill. Growing vegetables is something positive you bring to the world. And this is important for us as men, because as men, practical skills are things that we really need. They give us a sense of connection and a sense of meaning and purposefulness about our own life. This sort of the sense of, as a bloke, I've actually got something that I can contribute to the world that's of meaning. I know how to do things that matter. I don't just know how to do a whole lot of stuff. I know how to do something that matters, and I have a talent. If I've learned the basics of gardening, I've learnt skills that are not just valuable to me, and are not just valuable perhaps in the sense of, I've taught myself a little bit of knowledge. They're skills that are actually valuable to other people. They're skills that can be valuable to a family or to a community or to a group of people. And so for us as men, I think it's really important to have those kind of skills. It gives us a sense of purposefulness in the world, and it gives us a sense that I'm contributing something, or that I have something of value to contribute to the world. And for a lot of men, they really struggle with that sense of how their masculinity plays out in the world and what it is that they bring to the world. And if we're not careful and we don't have things of value that we can bring to the world, then often what we do is we go looking in all the wrong places to try and prove our strength to the world and prove that we are something that matters. So this is something that actually gives us that skill that really matters. I think that gardening helps to break the mold, the hold of consumerism that often a lot of us, and I include myself in this, it's very easy to fall into this. We are very good at being consumers today. We look to buy stuff. We look, quick fixes, easy solutions. I want to buy something. I want to buy a service. I want to buy a product. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of that, but the point is that if we get stuck into a mode of consumerism, often that starts to spill over into other areas where it shouldn't be. We start treating the world around us and people around us like products. We act like a consumer in our relationships when we shouldn't be acting like a consumer. And gardening is something where, gardening is about more than just consuming. Gardening is about making contribution as well. It's about connecting with, the end product, the vegetables that you will find on your table at the end of it all. You're connected with them in a intimate, quote unquote way. I don't mean that in a dodgy sounding way, but you're connected with the process that got them there. You're not just a mindless consumer who turns up and says, right, give me my stuff, I want it now. There's a process that you've been involved with. Gardens, next good reason why I think this matters for men is gardens are cyclical things, and they work according to the cycle of the natural world. And this is important. I think it just teaches us and reminds us too about the seasons, and there's a parallel to our own lives in that. Like, not every day in our life is summer. Some days, some weeks, some months, you go through periods of winter, just like a vegetable garden does. And I think there's something about a vegetable garden that sort of, it's a small little reminder. Subconsciously, it just sits there in our lives and reminds us of that reality, that our lives, just like the natural world is cyclical, so are our lives. Not every day is going to be on the top of the mountain. Not every day is going to be sunshine and roses. Not every day are you harvesting the fruits of your labors. Some days you are sort of toiling away and you can't see anything in front of you. You're looking at a blank canvas of soil and you don't even see any shoots of plants or anything. And our lives often are like that. There are days when life can be a real struggle, when you look at your day and what's going on and you think, well, what's the point in this? Where's the fruit in this? What's going on? And masculinity is very much like this as well. Masculinity is not really rocket science, but it does take effort. And it's about just doing those basics, and you can keep doing them day in and day out, regardless of whether it's summer or winter for you that particular day. Whether you're on a high and life feels great and it all makes sense, or whether or not it might be a bit of a struggle for you. There's some challenges that you're facing. And, growing a vegetable garden is the same sort of thing. You do that, and what happens, you keep doing those basics, and you get a stability in your life as a man that allows you to actually function well in the world, that it creates a certain immunity, if you like. No man is ever invincible, but it creates a certain level of immunity to some of the things in the world. It gives you resilience, basically, if you do the basics and you just keep doing them. So a garden, I think, in the nature, the fact that it's cyclical, it reminds us about that. The other thing about gardens, of course, is death. Death is an ever-present reality in a garden. And if you do gardening, as I do, this. That things come to the end of their summer season, comes to an end as it just has recently here in New Zealand. And what happens? The plants start to die off, and you dig things out, and you clear away, and you start something new. You prepare for something new. And so I think for us, it's a really good thing to be reminded of our own mortality and to be reminded of death. Yeah, Josie, and that's a great point. Mass consumerism is like consuming rotten fruit without any real utility or satisfaction. But yeah, so a garden reminds us of death. And that's an important thing. I think for a lot of men today, we live in a culture where we don't like to talk about death. We don't like to be reminded of it. We don't like to be reminded of our own mortality. But our lives will come to an end at some point. And I think it's really important for us as men to be reminded of that fact, because it then reminds us to not just live day to day for that particular day. It's about, what am I living for that's bigger than just this moment? What am I actually giving to this world, so that when my time finally comes to an end, and hopefully for you guys it will be many, 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 many years from now, but who knows, it could be any time for any of us. When that moment happens and it's the day of my funeral and people are standing around after we've put the coffin in the ground and they're at the reception, what are they going to be saying about me? What are they going to be saying about my contribution to the world as a man? What are they going to be saying about what I brought to the world? Or is there going to be very little to say? And so they're just going to be talking about the lovely triangle chicken sandwiches and asking where the drinks are because they don't have much to say. So it's good to be reminded, I think, of our own mortality, and it gives us a certain perspective. I think it was Thomas Aquinas who talked about this idea that in one sense death is an evil thing because it robs the world of something good, a human person. But in another sense, there's a profound good also in death because it's kind of like the great leveler. It's the hound that keeps snapping away at your heels and encourages you to actually make the most of each moment and to make the most of the life that you're given. And you only get one chance at it. So actually do it well. And what I mean by do it well is don't just live a life of self-satisfying self-gratification and pleasure-seeking, no, hedonism. Live a life where you are seeking to give of yourself to others and to the world around you and to something greater than yourself. And in doing so, you flourish, and so does everyone else around you, and the world is made better because of that. And as I said, a garden is a little tiny reminder. It works on a season and things die. And it's a sort of like this little reminder there that death is a reality in the world too. And this is an important point here, is that next one is that manual labor is a really important thing for men. Manual labor of some kind, we should, as men, I think we should be doing manual labor, I think ideally at least once a week as men, some committed bout of manual labor. Why is this important? I think it's especially important if you spend a lot of time locked behind a desk. And my work often does that. I'm out and about. I have speaking engagements and I travel sometimes too, but I also have a lot of desk work, and I'm stuck behind a desk or I'm looking at a computer screen like I am right now. But what manual labor does is it gets me out and into the world. That's the first thing. So I'm getting fresh air, which is really, really good. Also, why it's different from just other forms of exercise is that manual labor, it clears your head. I don't know about the rest of you guys in the room and girls in the room, but for me, what I find about manual labor is it clears my head. It allows me, no matter what stress is going on, if I'm actually able to give myself to a period of good manual labor, then everything else just melts away. And Obi-Wan asked, does the gym count? I'm stuck behind a desk all day, but work out most days. Yeah, and I try and get on at least the treadmill once a day as well. So I get on the treadmill and I walk for sort of 45 minutes to an hour every day if I can't get out and do a walk. I also try and get out on a regular basis. Those who've been watching my channel for a while who know me will know that I also hunt for either pest control or for eating. I don't do sport hunting. And so, like I've just been away on a hunt last weekend, Friday and Saturday night, an overnighter, and that was quite intense. There's probably about 5 or 6 hours of really intense, demanding exercise involved in trekking up a steep hill, getting an animal and then having to cart it out again and all the rest of it. So I do those kind of things, but work, like manual labor type stuff as well on top of that. Why? Because for a couple of reasons. Number one is that it clears your head. It clears your head, and also on top of clearing your head, it also gives you like a productive line of progression you can look at. So for example, if you mow a lawn, you can look back in 40 minutes, say, and you can say, look what I've just done. And often a lot of our work today, particularly if you're stuck behind a desk, if you're stuck in situations where you're dealing in the sort of the modern workplace environment, what happens is you don't get that privilege and that blessing of being able to see, you know what, look how much progress I've achieved today. Often there are days, and probably a lot of you will identify with this, where you just feel that you feel like you've taken one step forward and 20 steps backwards, and you get to the end of it and you think, what the heck is going on? What did that make any difference? You don't have that same thing when you tend to a garden or you mow a lawn. You weed a patch of garden, you look at it half an hour later and you go, look what I did. And you can actually see something, and you get a sense of, the Greeks talked about this, the idea of the habitus of work, and the idea that you should never be like to give a man menial work where he can't find a sense of meaning, and that is actually a really awful thing to do to a person. Imagine being told you must just restack the same shelf every day, day after day, and there's no sense of why stacking that shelf matters. And then also on top of that, you don't even get to look back at the end of the day and see that you've made any progress. It would be just an awful thing to be stuck in a situation like that. So gardening is a meaningful form of work. And not only that, but you are also able to know, you know what, I put in the hard work now and I'm doing something good here. I'm going to be consuming some vegetables in a couple of months' time, or I'm going to be feeding my family, or I'm going to be giving this to the neighborhood, or whatever it is. What are you going to do with that produce? But the point is that manual labor is really important for us as men, and particularly that sense of I have achieved something and I'm doing something good here, and as a sort of a de-stressing thing. And lastly, and this is a really important point, I think this is the big one for me, is that gardening requires self-giving of us as men. In order to actually garden well and to actually grow an effective vegetable garden, you have to give yourself to it. Gardens don't work to our schedule. So you can't say, right, garden, I want you to work to my schedule. And funnily enough, so much of our lives today are about, make your life easy, find the quick fix, get the thing that will work to your schedule. TV on demand, or it's not even TV on demand now, it's Netflix. You watch what you want to watch when you want to watch. And so much of our life is sort of structured in that way. It's about finding things that will work to our schedule. Now, what's interesting about that is that what that means is that more and more I, the individual, and what I want becomes the most important guiding factor for how I should structure my life. That is not a good thing for us as men, if that is the sort of the guiding principle. What do I want? How can I achieve what I want when I want it? There are times when that's a good thing, but as a sort of governing, guiding philosophy for life, it's a really bad thing, particularly for us as men. And a garden doesn't work like that. You can't tell a garden to work on your schedule. The garden will do what the garden is going to do. So you've got to give yourself to that schedule. It's constantly calling you out of yourself in order to do it well. If you want to be successful, you have to give yourself to it. That's just the reality of it. Like, for example, if you're growing tomatoes, and it's that time in the tomato growth process where they start shooting off those extra tendrils, you have to start culling some of those off. Otherwise, the nutrients are not directed as they should, and you don't get the same yield of fruit. You can't just say, oh, stuff it, I'm just going to ignore it, and then come back and get a big harvest of tomatoes at the end of the season. It doesn't work that way. So you have to give yourself to it. Gardens are ultimately about delayed gratification too, and they require work to get the fruit. You don't just say, right, I want it now, I'm going to get it now, and I'll have it, thank you very much. They require patience, and that's a really good thing for us as men. I think that virtue of patience is important. Why might this matter? Well, self-giving is really the bedrock of virtue and of, I think, authentic and very heroic masculinity in the world. It is what's required for that is self-giving. And it's so important for us as men to develop, and even in small ways, like in a vegetable garden, that habit of self-giving. Because if you can, this is the thing, like a lot of us know what we want. And particularly when we think about things like relationships and stuff like that, we think, I want to be successful in the area of relationships. And we know what we want. And we know the outcome we want. And the outcomes we want are usually good things. But what a lot of men and a lot of us tend to forget today is that in order to get that good outcome, it doesn't just happen by chance. You don't just fall into it. You don't just stumble into it. You can't live a life of self-seeking hedonism and then suddenly one day meet the love of your life and then say, right, now I'm ready to commit and be this good, faithful man. If you haven't actually built that habit into your life already, it's not going to suddenly just magically start happening. And so a garden is a small way to actually, it's a small way, obviously nothing compared to, say, a marriage, but having kids or any of those other things that are really big and huge in the world. But a garden is a small way to actually to have instill a regular pattern of self-giving into your life. And self-giving is so fundamentally important for us as men. I think it's one of the most, it is a really important civilizing factor for us as men in the world. And one of the most effective civilizing agents of men in the world is marriage, or it was marriage. And in the West, marriage rates are declining. So our latest data has come out in New Zealand in the last 2 weeks. And it shows that our marriage rate is now in a really low place. It's dropped considerably. In a lot of Western countries, that's a trend that's consistent. Now, that's troubling to me for a whole lot of reasons. Regardless of why it might be happening, it's really troubling because marriage is and has been one of the most effective, and particularly marriage and having kids, obviously, the most effective civilizing mechanisms in a society. Why might this be? Well, because if you commit yourself to a person for life, and there's no running away from that, you have to make it work. You have to give yourself to that. Having children requires self-giving of you. you can't do parenting well without self-sacrificial love. And what happens is, for us as men, the more we give ourselves to those self-sacrificial acts, the more of the rough edges are knocked off, the more civilized we become. And so for me, it's quite concerning that marriage is now declining so heavily, and having children is declining as well in the West, because this is the most, and has been the most effective civilizing agent for men in the West. And it raises some interesting questions, well, I guess concerning questions about what does the future look like for us if we have a whole lot of men who are missing out on this. Like, I am now a far better man than what I was the day before I got married. I'm now a far better and I think more virtuous man. I'm not a saint by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm far better and far more virtuous than what I was before I had kids, because of what that actually demands of you, and the way that transforms you. And then that has a bearing on wider society. It has a huge bearing on wider society. And funnily enough, a lot of the same sort of very militant, perhaps you might say the militant feminist voices who are really strong on the whole question of the topic of toxic masculinity. I'm going to do a video on that issue, by the way, because I don't use that term, me personally, and I've stopped using it because I don't think it's a valid term, and I'll explain why in this video I'm going to do in future. But the point is that the same groups of people who are often very hot on that issue then don't want to recognise perhaps how some of their ideologies about marriage and children are not that important, or I'm sort of not into those things at all, how that's actually contributing to the very same problem, or to this problem that they want to solve here. And so for men, it's really important. Self-giving is important, and gardening is a small form of self-giving. You have to give yourself to a garden. You can't do it on your terms. It's not self-gratifying. It requires patience. It requires effort. It requires work, and it works to its schedule. And it's a green version of a child in some ways. Obviously, nowhere near as important. But the point is that a child's like that too. A child requires input of you on a schedule. 2 a.m. when your child is sick, you can't just say, "Well, stop being sick now." And a garden, if you want to be successful at it, you have to give yourself to it. And self-giving is one of the most fundamental things about masculinity. The other thing about gardening that's really important is gardening is really about just doing the basics well. And if you keep doing those basics, then at the end of it, you get the fruit. So is masculinity. Masculinity is about doing the basics day in and day out. And if you keep doing the basics, then guess what? You look back on your life a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, and you go, hey, look at that. Look what I've managed to achieve. Look how I now have these new habits in my life. Things I thought I could never, ever do have now become just habitual things. I don't even think twice about it. Patterns of behaving I thought I'd never overcome. How did I do that? By just doing the basics and just giving myself to doing that day in and day out, as unglamorous as that is. There's no quick fix here. So yeah, that's my thoughts for today on why I think every man should have some form of garden in their life. And if you can't have a garden because that's, for whatever reason, is an absolute impossibility for you, I don't know, learn a hobby like brewing beer, because brewing beer is something, again, that has some of these same traits. Find something that requires of you that sort of that habit, that regular pattern of it. As a way of sort of clearing your head as well, getting out of the stresses and challenges of life, but also requires that self-giving of you that also connects you back to a bit of nature and gives you a sense of something that you can look at and say, hey, you know what, that's actually a productive skill. I think most men would agree that brewing beer is a very productive skill for men to have in the world. I'm certainly very grateful for the men in this world who are very competent at that skill, but it's really, really important to do that. Before I wrap things up with a moment of challenge, let me just have a look at some of these live stream comments and catch up with some of them now, and feel free to chime in with anything else you want to, any thoughts or questions that you might have. So Clint says this, great idea, masculinity starts with diet, health and energy to help others. Yeah, it's a really important point. Again, the basics, Clint. Consider keeping chickens for eggs. Yes, I want to keep chickens for eggs, but my wife says we don't have enough room here. So there's a constant running debate in our house about whether I think we do enough room for it. And chickens for eggs, and meat as a reminder of life and death. If I could run sheep on my quarter acre, I would. Yeah, I'm the same as you. I often say to people that in an ideal world, I would just be this guy who disappeared off into the wild blue yonder with my family and had a farm and just was a farmer, and was this guy who just quietly went about his life raising his kids, in the best way possible, and being a farmer. I think there's something about that is really good. Child Harold says, excellent analogy. You can't just get beautiful flowers without having cultivated the ground over time. That's a really, really good thing. Old Soul says, life after Eden, the fruit is a result of the sweat from our brow, present in every aspect of our lives. Yeah, it's so true. It's a really good, important point. Old Soul also says, Dad told stories of him walking through his grandmother's garden and picking tomatoes from the plants and eating them because he was always hungry as a child. Yeah, so there's something about that, right, and a connection with the world around you that sort of really matters. So another question here, what is the book that offers the best advice about masculinity? Well, that's a very good question. I don't think there is one book that actually offers the best advice. I think there are a series of books. I'm going to talk about this in a future episode, actually, about the importance of reading and perhaps what that might mean in a bigger sort of context for men. But I would say there are definitely some books, really good books out there that offer various aspects of it. Eric Greitens, who recently had a bit of a fall from grace, his own personal moral life had a few issues, but he wrote a very, very good book that I thought was really helpful, and I've recommended to other. In fact, he wrote a couple of really good books actually. Eric Greitens was an ex-Special Forces soldier in the States, and the first book he wrote, The Hand in the Fist, The Heart in the Fist, was where he told his story, and he's a fascinating guy in the sense that he volunteered and spent time working with Mother Teresa's nuns. And he also went to Rwanda post-genocide, not long after the genocide, and was working in a role there, like a sort of a charitable aid type role there. And then from there, he realizes that he has this calling to use his skills in a different way, and he becomes a soldier, and a Special Forces soldier at that. And a lot of his family were apparently sort of kind of surprised, but others were not. They said, well, if anyone was going to do it, it'd be him. But it was kind of a big departure and a big change for him. But so his first book, the Heart and the Fist, was about his story, and it's a fascinating read. The second one, where I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but he gave really good advice. It was basically a series of letters, or it was written in the style of letters to a friend of his, who had come back from one of the wars, one of those awful situations, and I think might have served in Afghanistan and possibly even Iraq. Had come back, and he'd pulled up into his driveway one night. He got out of the truck, and all of a sudden he just had a moment of PTSD, and he was absolutely convinced that an enemy sniper had a bead on him, was targeting him, and he lay behind his truck for hours, frozen, waiting, so he could sneak back under cover of darkness back into his house. This is back in the States. And it was all just this moment of PTSD from this awful experience of the war that caught up with him. And then from there, that spiraled into drinking. And the drinking then took a heavy toll on his marriage and his family life. And it did untold, as he lost his job, I believe, as a result of that. And just the whole thing collapsed. And so this book was written by Eric Greitens as a series of letters of really practical advice for his friend about what he needed to do to get his life back on track. And it's practical advice for any man, and it's really, really good stuff. And it's a combination, interestingly enough, of very practical advice and also like philosophy. He quotes Augustine in the book. He talks about Aristotle, but then he's also talking about really practical things that you need to do. And one of the things that I always remember and I often use when I'm talking to groups of men from that book is he talked about when they're in the Special Forces and they learn about how to navigate properly with a compass. And what you do with compass navigation is you put the compass on the ground, you find your heading where you're meant to be going, you find the point, the landmark, the object, and then you head towards it. And then what do? You take another heading. And then, and all of a sudden you find yourself where you're meant to be after many, many hours or days or whatever it is, you get to where you're going. But if your compass is off, if your bearing is even off by a few small degrees, you don't end up where you need to be going. You end up wildly off track. And so it's important, that's a really fundamental truth for us as men. That's just those small things again. Those small things can have a huge bearing on the final destination where we actually end up with our masculinity. So I would say it's a collection of books. Someone here has chimed in with what I was about to say is I think one of the most excellent books that every man should read. Jeremiah, thank you. You have said Viktor Frankl's the the meaning of life. A Man's Search for Meaning is the book by Viktor Frankl, and it is an excellent book. One of the best self-help books, quote unquote, ever written. It is a book I think every man should read. Now, why is it so important? Because Viktor Frankl spent time in 5 different Nazi concentration camps as a Jewish prisoner of war. He lost his wife and unborn child in Auschwitz. So this guy saw and lived that reality. And he comes out of that environment and he writes this book about how you find true meaning in life. And what's the answer? He says, you find true meaning not by the will to power, which is the Nietzschean sort of thing, and not by the will to pleasure, which is Sigmund Freud's thing. It's about pleasure. So Nietzsche, it's about power. Freud, it's about pleasure. He says those are not the other two extremes you avoid. That's not how you find meaning in life. It's this whole idea you talk about a will to meaning. It's really a will to self-sacrificial love and self-giving, and that's how you find yourself. And he talks about his time in those camps and some of the stuff he saw. So the first 3/4 of the book is actually his story about being in the camps. And it's really deep and it's very real and it's gritty stuff, but it's then the final third is just he talks a little bit about something called his logotherapy or logos therapy, which is his new way of doing psychoanalysis with patients. And it's a really, really good book. It's not a huge read. People are kind of surprised when they discover how small a book it is, but it is so very, very important as a book. And I think every man should absolutely read Man's Search for Meaning. Old Souls mentioned John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Yeah, that's true, actually. Wild at Heart. John Eldredge is a religious author, Christian. That book is good. There's plenty of stuff in there. Even if you're not a Christian, you probably still get stuff out of that book. There was another one, Healing the Masculine Soul. Gordon Delby's or Dembley. There's plenty of, there's quite a few good books around. I think the thing you want in a book about masculinity is one that actually starts from a perspective of that masculinity is a good and real and important thing in the world. It's not something to be disparaged or feminized. It's actually something that needs to be harnessed with virtue. That's the sort of starting point that you need, I think, in a good book about masculinity. And I think secondly is you want to avoid any sort of book that is all about some sort of brutish expression of, masculinity is about smashing the world and showing people how indestructible you are. Like, it's not. It's about more than that. Masculinity is about resilience, but resilience is not the same thing as being indestructible. And it's not the same thing as about sheer brute force and violence. And I would argue those things are actually failures of masculinity. Although there are moments when men must step up and do the hard work, and that includes things like soldiering and protecting families and things like that, but that's built on love. It's not built on... I read a book last year by a guy, a special forces guy, who was writing about his experiences, and the whole book read very much like that. It was like a guy who was boasting about the violence and the violent acts he'd done, rather than a man just telling his story about being in that theatre of war. And it is a very noticeable difference, and he's actually openly sort of at times almost gloating about these acts of violence. And I would argue that's not a healthy or good expression of masculinity at all. That those moments where masculine strength is required to bring maybe even force to the world, it must be always motivated by love. It must always be about that whole sense of love and protection of what is good. The person's behind me I'm trying to protect. And the fundamental truths that will result in great harm to other people if I don't step up and protect them, those kind of things. And so, as opposed to sort of acts of violence and physical force. So yeah, that would be my advice. If you're looking for good books about masculinity, those two things are key. Masculinity is actually a good and important thing. It doesn't need to be feminized. It needs to be just harnessed with virtue. And secondly, that idea that it's not about, just being thuggish or so stoic that you don't show emotions and things like that. To be honest with you, I think that's a bit of a cop-out too. You hear this a lot from people. Men are always told today that they can't cry and they shouldn't cry and big boys don't cry. I've got to be honest with you, I really don't think a lot of particularly young men are hearing that message today. I don't know. I grew up in my dad was sort of pretty stoic in a lot of ways, and man of his generation, and a few issues in his life. He's come from a farming background and a few sort of parenting issues that had a bearing on that. But even I never got... My dad was never someone say, "Oh, you don't cry, son. Crying is a sign of weakness." And I just don't think today that there are that many guys. I think that's sort of a convenient sort of straw man sort of scapegoat. We create a caricature, and then people use that to leap off of and share whatever ideological position they want to. But they always start by making out that every young boy is being told you shouldn't cry, and if you show weakness, it really, I think that's not that common for a lot of men today. Yeah, that's just my humble opinion anyway. Okay. I don't think femininity should intrude on a man's world. Yeah, well, I think realistically there are going to be what we need is complementarity. That's the essential thing that's missing. It's the one thing that our society is not talking about, because it's a lot of ideologies have thrown that out the window, that there are differences between men and women bring different strengths to the world as a general rule. There are exceptions that prove the rule, but the general norm is that men and women bring different strengths and gifts and weaknesses to the world, and we need each other. And what I am lacking as a male, my wife, for example, complements in me, or other females around me complement in me, because they are strong in those areas, and vice versa. What my wife is lacking, her feminine genius, doesn't have all the answers, and so, but when we're together, really good things happen in the world. And so complementarity is really, really the key. And so men need to be willing to learn from that and to curb their excesses, because, why is marriage such a civilizing and important civilizing factor in the world? Because what it does is it knocks off those brutish edges of men. And what happens is that the feminine genius brings that important gentleness into our lives and calls us to be more than just sort of thugs and barbarians. And then vice versa, masculinity, does really important things for in a marriage context for the women who are involved in that as well. Mr. Smith says, but there is a difference between stoicism and lack of emotion. You're right, Mr. Smith. I agree. And I think that confuses people. And you're right. And one of the things that I think drives me a little bit batty is this. There is now, it's almost like the pendulum swung too far the other way. And we a lot of people now are talking about the problem of a lack of resilience in children. And they talk about the fact you've got to build resilience into your children. And I think a reason why there's a lack of resilience. So we used to talk about helicopter parenting, which is where parents would sweep in and save their child from any problem. We are now talking about what they call lawnmower parenting, which is even worse. Lawnmower parenting is where the parent runs ahead of the child and mows down any obstacles in their path so they never have to deal with anything difficult. And that's even worse than just rescuing them from a difficult situation. You're actually now trying to actively avoid the situation for your children. But the point is that there's a lot of conversation now about we need to build resilience into our kids. And I think one of the reasons why we're even having that conversation is because we spent so long confusing what stoicism was. And that, like you've just talked about there, Mr. Smith, the difference between stoicism and a lack of emotion. And actually, a little stoicism is a good thing. There are moments when you must, as a man, you must have a stoicism about you. There must be that. There are other moments where stoicism, or where just sort of going into yourself and locking everything up and hiding yourself from the world is an absolute disaster and be the worst thing that you could actually do. So again, it's about both and. It's about a balance. But we've spent so long over the last decade or two saying, no, just put all of your emotions out there, and that's the healthy thing to do. I'm not convinced it is. Jonathan, good to see you. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Phil. Good to see you. Thanks for the support, mate. Really appreciate it. Mr. Smith says, my wife makes me a better person, covers my faults, and enhances my qualities. And I think that's right. I owe a great debt to my wife and to our children. I was thinking about this the other day. In fact, I often say this to groups that I'm speaking to, that I speak to about masculinity. Having children is the most bizarre thing in the world. And it dawned on me a couple of years ago. I had to go into the toilet and wipe my son's bottom. And it dawned on me, here I was doing this thing, wiping another human being's bum. Yet it wasn't something I was in there going, yay, this is awesome. But at the same time, I wasn't in there going, oh, I hate this is awful. I was like, I'm actually quite happy to be doing this for my son. And think about that. A man in any other context, if someone said to you, would you go into that toilet and wipe another human being's bottom? You'd think, why would I do that? Ugh. When you have children, that whole thing changes, and the way you give yourself to the world, it really is quite a profoundly good thing for us, and it transforms us in profoundly important ways. Yes. Okay. I'm a teacher, and I see that quite often. Yeah, well, you're right. And I think teachers are often on the front line of dealing with this, where they see the fruit of this idea of not building resilience into kids and not helping them to actually sort of have a balance here about what they do. So that's my thoughts on the topic. Thanks for the great questions, guys. Just having a look, see if there's anything else obvious I've missed. Okay, I have a friend who is a single mother who constantly complains about her son. This is a practical question. She says he behaves badly, but it just sounds like he's being a boy. I would love to see advice to mothers of sons. So I have a friend who's a single mother who constantly complains about her son. She says he behaves badly, but it just sounds like he's being a boy. And yeah, that can be an issue for sure. So young boys behave differently to young girls, and young boys often too, in my experience, know how to push their mother's buttons, even unintentionally. The other thing about young boys that they tend to do is they will take as much rope as they can. And I see this with my kids. My daughters, yeah, they can be naughty and they can ignore mum and all the rest of it. But it seems that my son, he'll just keep ignoring. And what he'll often do is he waits for dad to come down and the big dad voice, get to your room now. It's bedtime. All of a sudden, oh, I better act. And I know for my wife that's frustrating. And she says, why doesn't he do that for me? And, she often feels a bit like she's not quite getting it right, or he doesn't respect her the same, and so she finds that really, really frustrating. It's because he as a bloke it's just that threat of I guess DEFCON 1. Here comes the nuclear option, Dad. I better actually step up and do something about this now. This is a classic example of the strengths and the differences that men and women bring to the world. But then there are other moments where I want to go to DEFCON 1, and what's needed is that gentle, nurturing hand that the feminine genius is so good at, and my wife brings to the word, and that has to remind me, just slow your roll here. What's needed is something else here. And so I think often for women it can be a struggle when they're raising boys, particularly if they're on their own. And my wife and I often talk about this, how hard it must be for solo parents to raise children. Because at times it's difficult enough with two of us in the room. How much harder is it? And for solo mums to do it. So if I was you and I was giving you advice, I would say to your friend, in the most gentle and prudent way possible, don't be a know-it-all, but the most gentle and prudent way possible would be to say, or to encourage good male role models in the life of that boy. If she doesn't have those already, he needs good male role models. And also perhaps to remind her of the good things that you see in that boy, so she starts to see it as well. All it takes is that positive reminder, hey, look what he did here. That was really awesome. Or I saw him doing this, and that was a really good thing. And it reminds her that her son he's not just a problem. He's not just a point of frustration. But it must be extremely hard when you're doing that on your own. So that's me. We're almost at an hour, so I'll wrap things up here. And I guess my moment of challenge just to conclude this very first episode of Forge. Thanks, Old Soul. Great content, sir. Thank you for your efforts in facilitating these discussions. God bless from the States. Thanks, mate, for being here. I really appreciate that. And long may it continue. This is the first of many. So before I wrap up with this final challenge, don't forget, spread the word, please. Tell people once a month, and I'll publicize it in advance. I'm sort of at the moment. I'm just trying to find what the best time zone to make this all work is. So there's a little bit of experimentation going on at the moment to try and find this, the sweet spot. But yeah, spread the word, tell your friends, get them along as well, and don't forget to send me emails and topics and things that you want me to talk about. And the more focused we can make this, the better. Okay, so this final moment of challenge, and I was reading again one of my favourite pieces of poetry the other day from the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, or Yeats, depending on where you come from. But it's called The Second Coming. And I just want to read the first, it's like a two-part poem. It's not a long one. I just want to read the first part, the first verse, if you like. And there's something in particular that's really important that he says in that. So here's the poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. There's a second part to that poem as well, but for me, particularly this first part of that poem really sums up, I think, a lot of the problems and the struggles that we are dealing with in the world today. The centre cannot hold. And for a lot of men, that's a really big issue. They don't have anything, that sense of grounding, that sense of direction, that sense of purpose in life. They are just tossed about by an ever-changing. One particular commentator has referred to it as liquid modernity. It's not just the fact that massive changes are happening, but the rate of change is so fast, we never actually getting the opportunity to ground ourselves and get deep roots at any moment. We're just constantly tossed about from side to side. And so that's very much, I think, a very apt description of where we're at today. But then that final statement, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Doesn't that sum up social media in a lot of ways? Doesn't that sum up the public square right now? The best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. But here's the challenge for us as men. It's very easy to read a line like that and think, yeah, those other bad people out there who lack all conviction, and those awful people who are just the worst are full of that passionate intensity. I'm not like that. But in actual fact, the challenge for all of us is this, that any of us can fall back into that way of acting and thinking and speaking and being in the world at any point. That's the thing. It's not like you suddenly achieve masculine nirvana where you become a good man and then you will always be a good man. It's a constant daily thing. It's a constant moment by moment thing that you have to give yourself to. So I guess the challenge at the end of this month's episode is, do we lack conviction at times? Are we full of passionate intensity when we shouldn't be? What are we doing to focus ourselves each day, each hour, each moment to actually give ourselves in a way that really means something? Hopefully that's been helpful. If you like the content I'm creating and you want to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how to do that are found in the video description below. As I said, please share the video, spread the word. This one will be up on YouTube very soon. And also, for those who are wondering, there's a regular weekly live stream that will be happening. It's going to be happening in 2 days' time. So here in New Zealand, that's a Wednesday. In other parts of the world, it's on a Tuesday. But in 2 days' time, my regular weekly live stream, which talks about stuff that's been in the news and movie news and things like that's going to be happening each week. But this one here, Forge, will be happening on a monthly basis. Thanks for joining in. You guys are awesome. I will see you next time on Forge.